What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here, and I want to talk to you about an X-Men book that I recently finished reading. New X-Men, Childhood's End, Volume 3. This is by the same creative team that's been doing these Childhood's End volumes. Craig Kyle, Chris Yost, I believe Paco Medina is still on this. Let's see, yes, Paco Medina, as well as another artist, Duncan Rouleau. He has done some stuff with Joe Casey and Joe Kelly, those guys. He's part of their own little studio that they've all done stuff together with. I can't think of anything he's done right off the top of my head. I want to say he did a story with Joe Casey called Code Flesh, but that might have been another guy. I think he may have done some Walking Dead in the early days of that comic. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. This collects issues 28 through 32 of New X-Men, and it basically concludes the opening arc of Craig Kyle and Chris Yost's New X-Men run. This has basically just been, as I said in the previous videos reviewing the first two volumes of their run, the first 12 issues is basically one giant storyline, and then this kind of leads into the next storyline, but Volume 4 is much more its own thing, whereas these three volumes all kind of interconnect, and you really can't just jump into this one without the other two. They lead into each other, and they all three read together basically as one really long story. And as I liked Volume 2 a lot more than Volume 1, I liked Volume 3 quite a bit more than Volume 2. I've never really understood this fascination with the character of William Stryker. I thought he was great in the God Loves, Man Kills original graphic novel, but I have never understood this desire to make him be an ongoing threat for the X-Men and continue to bring him back as a recurring enemy. That's something that's always puzzled me a little bit, so I like this volume because we don't have any William Stryker. He was eliminated in the previous volume, and now, as was hinted at the end of the previous volume, we've got Nimrod. He's right there on the back cover here, and this might make you think that Iron Man and Miss Marvel are like a huge part of the storyline. They really are not. They're investigating all the deaths at that church that Nimrod was being held at, the deaths of William Stryker's disciples. They're investigating all of that, and then Miss Marvel goes to the school to try and talk to the X-Men about joining the pro-registration heroes during the Civil War, because this is going on right in the middle of the superhero Civil War, which is, I guess, kind of timely that I'm reviewing this book right now, since we are going to have a superhero Civil War in the movies with Captain America Civil War, and then we're also getting another superhero Civil War in the comics. So anyway, what's going on here is that basically Emma Frost says, you guys are all a bunch of idiots, because the X-Men have been dealing with this kind of persecution for a really long time, and none of you guys have ever tried to help us. And I've been saying that for years, both Captain America and Iron Man. It was really weird to me after Avengers vs. X-Men that Captain America was suddenly like, hey, I've basically been ignoring mutant problems for my entire life. And I said, yes, he has. And I pointed to very specific examples in the comics where the mutants were going through stuff like this, and then Captain America didn't seem to care, but then whenever it was the superheroes who had to register, suddenly Captain America's like, no, this is a bad thing, we have to fight against it. And then here, we've got the Avengers, they're saying, listen, this is the right thing to do. You guys should help us because you guys are the good guys, and you need to help us do this thing. And Emma Frost says, yes, we are the good guys, and we helped you right at the beginning of the Civil War. We were there in Stamford when all this stuff was going down. And then we've got all these problems going on here at the school, and you guys haven't been helping us. So that's kind of, in my opinion, a pretty cool Emma Frost moment. I know I have been complaining about Emma Frost in this book because she was acting pretty villainous. They really toned her down as far as her villainy is concerned in this book. She acts a lot more sympathetic, and part of that is she's not in the book as much. She's not actively trying to get X-23 killed by some of the other students in an impromptu training session, so she's not as bad here as she was in some of the other volumes. I really like the idea that for this team, basically their baptism of fire, where they're really going into their first superhero mission. Yes, they've seen some action before, but it hasn't been anything huge like this. I really like that for their first actual mission together, it's something huge like Nimrod. Nimrod was a big villain that the X-Men never really faced that much. He was kind of hanging around in the Marvel Universe in the 80s for like a year and a half before he actually faced off against the X-Men. It took a really long time of him just like hanging out in the Marvel Universe before he and the X-Men fought, and it was not an easy battle. There were some casualties on both sides, and then that led directly into, I want to say, the Mutant Massacre, which led to some more casualties, so this was a big era of change for the X-Men, and there were some deaths going on whenever they fought Nimrod. And so I really like the idea of, okay, we're going to take this team that has barely been trained, they know how to use their powers, but they don't really know how to fight a big actual villain threat, and they definitely don't know how to work together. And we're going to have them face not somebody wimpy like the Blob or Eunice the Untouchable. We're going to have them face Nimrod, who is one of the scariest, most terrifying villains that the X-Men have ever faced, because the adult X-Men would have trouble with Nimrod at this power level, and these guys have to face him. I really like that idea. Other than that, I did want to talk a little bit about the weird confusion of Nimrod's timeline here. So, in the original 1980s X-Men comics that introduced Nimrod, we were told that he came from the Days of Future Past timeline. Now, if you've just read the original two-part Days of Future Past storyline, Nimrod is not mentioned at any point in that story. But over the years, the X-Men comics would return back to that timeline, and they would say, okay, that one redheaded girl who was in the Days of Future Past storyline, she's actually the daughter of Cyclops and Jean Grey from an alternate future. And then even later still, they would say, okay, there was this super sentinel who led all the other sentinels. His name was Nimrod. And then he came back in time, and then that was seemingly the end of it. It was a pretty simple origin story for him. He comes from the Days of Future Past timeline, and then he comes back to the past, and then he gets eliminated, and then years later he is combined with the Master Mold Sentinel creation factory thing, and then they form what's his face? Bastion from Operation Zero Tolerance. And so basically it was a pretty straightforward, he comes from an alternate future into the past. Here, we are told it's a little bit more complicated than that. We are told that he actually comes from, at least this version of Nimrod, comes from an alternate timeline that is not the Days of Future Past timeline. He comes from some world where Forge and Storm got married and had 2 kids, and then that version of Forge sent that version of Nimrod to the 616 timeline in the present day. He basically said, okay, I don't want to deal with this thing, so I'm just going to send him to an alternate reality where someone else can deal with him. So that's a little weird. And then the new X-Men here, they and Forge basically say, okay, we can override his time machine thing that he's got inside him, and then it will eliminate him. It'll send him to some other timeline. And they do that, and then he is sent back to the 1980s, where he first appeared in the 616 Marvel Universe way back when. It's a little weird, because basically this is pretending like we never actually saw that Nimrod came from the Days of Future Past timeline. It would be fine, I guess, if we just out of nowhere saw Nimrod appear in the present day Marvel Universe back in the 1980s. If we had never been given this statement that he came from the Days of Future Past timeline, this would be an okay origin story. That he came from an alternate timeline, then he comes to the present day, then they send him back in time to the 1980s where he eventually becomes Bastion. That would have been fine, except that we had already been told in the 1980s that he came from the Days of Future Past timeline. So this is a really weird retcon that's needlessly confusing and complicated. I don't want to say it's confusing, but it is complicated. It's just needlessly complicates things that were already pretty simple. I mean, things did get a little weird and confusing after his origin story, where he merged with the Master Mold and became Bastion, but before that, things were pretty easy to understand with Nimrod. And then this, in my opinion, just kind of needlessly confuses things. It's not super confusing, but it is a little bit more confusing than it was. But overall, I really like this story, and more I'm finding myself wishing that this creative team had started with something like this. Instead of taking so long with this slow burn to get to this point, instead of taking 12 issues to get to this point, I wish they had just started with, okay, you've got all of the students at the school, most of them have lost their powers, and then these are the ones with their powers left, and then they have to fight Nimrod. I really didn't feel like they had to do so much build-up for this, but that's what they did, and so by this point, they had already lost me when this was coming out in single issues. I'm not really sure when I stopped reading in single issues. I think it was before this storyline concluded, but I'm not sure. Definitely before the beginning of the next storyline, but overall, I like this volume better than the previous 2 that this creative team had been working on. So that's my thoughts on New X-Men Childhood's End Volume 3. I forgot to mention, there is one issue here that basically shows us what Kevin Ford has been up to since he left in the previous volumes. At the very beginning of Kyle and Yoss's run on this book, Kevin Ford Ford, he accidentally withered Laurie Collins' hand, and so it was basically just a dead hunk of flesh hanging off of her arm, and then later she died, but he didn't know that. He ran away from the school, and then we get one issue here that tells us what he's been up to. We see that he joins forces with Selene, and that is going to be huge, but not in the New X-Men series. This creative team, or at least Kyle and Yost, they were only on New X-Men for another 2 volumes, I think, and then Messiah Complex happened, and then this series actually ended, and then they went on to do a brand new X-Force series, and Selene and Kevin Ford, that all became a big thing in their X-Force run, not in their New X-Men run. So if you've read the Necrosha storyline and you really like that, and you were curious where did the alliance between Kevin Ford and Selene come from, it starts here. So there is one issue that's, I don't think it's called Whatever Happened to Kevin Ford, but here on the back it says, plus Whatever Happened to Wither. So there's an issue for that, and I thought that was okay. I didn't really like the direction these guys took Wither in. Personally, I liked Wither back when he was first introduced in the New Mutant series, and he was a lot more of an arty kind of creative mind. He wasn't so much of a broody goth who was much closer to being a supervillain than he is here. Here he's already on his path to becoming a supervillain. I didn't like that direction for him, but it is what it is. I didn't like the direction that they had for a lot of the characters in this run, but by this point I'm kind of getting used to it because I'm actually starting to like the stories that these guys are doing. So those are all of my thoughts on New X-Men Childhood's End Volume 3. I hope that you guys liked this video, and I hope that I was able to maybe convince you to check this book out if you are interested in teenage mutants fighting for their lives against evil killer robots from the future. And I will be talking to you guys about another X-Men book next week, and I'll be talking to you about some other stuff later this week. So I hope you guys have a great day, and I will see you in the future. Have a good one.